and welcome to the Traveling Professors. I'm Professor Sheri, and Professor Bob's behind the camera over there, and we are in Paris, France. It's our first evening here, and we are in front of the Paleontology Museum. And as you see, I've got a Dino friend here. We're here for 3.5 weeks. We hope you enjoy the trip with us. We intend to have a blast, and we hope you do too. Bye for
Before we go inside the Museum of Natural History, and by the way, if you look at this map, we're going to be going in this building down here, which is the Museum of Paleontology and Comparative Anatomy. But there are 3 other buildings that go with the natural history. Before this was put in place, this was all part of the Jardin des Plantes and the Royal Menagerie, which is the Royal Zoo, which is one of the oldest zoos in the world. And it became this massive complex of museums of natural history and one of the most interesting dinosaur museums in the world. It certainly is not the largest, but it certainly is spectacular, as you will see. But we need to go and get a little background as to how this came about. Here we have George Cuvier, who many of you, if you've studied dinosaurs, are very familiar with. You see, in the 1790s, he was brought into Paris because as they were excavating a gypsum mine in Paris to help restore some of the damage to the buildings in the Revolution, they were finding bones of what we now know as dinosaurs. And he was an expert on assembling these bones. He had done it in the Netherlands, and so they brought him to Paris. And he put together, to some extent, one of the first collections of dinosaur bones. And then in 1800, he gave a lecture to the scientists of the period, talking about them and saying that this is a group of creatures that became extinct, and he started discussing about what mass extinctions were and how they occurred. So later on, he founds in 1802 the Galleries of Comparative Anatomy, which are bones and skeletons and preserved organs, and that remained in place until they will ultimately be moved into this new museum complex. So that's George Cuvier. The next important figure in the anthropology and anatomy world is Armand Quartrefages de Brou, a professor of anthropology, and the man who wrote significant literature on, as you can see here in one of his works, the human species. He did a study of the pygmies. He did studies of all sorts of different humans and tribes and other things. And he created, in 1855, what is called the Galleries of Anthropology, where they collected all of the skeletons and bones and materials about different ethnic groups and anthropological groups. So it's the second museum. So you have Cuvier's museum, and then you have Quartrefages museum. And these two were just about full by the time you get to the 1890s. Well, in the 1880s and 90s, there was serious discussion as to what to do about these buildings that have all of these wonderful collections and how do they preserve them. And fortunately, 2 events occurred that helped to make this happen. One is the 100th anniversary of the French Natural History Museum, which was founded in 1793. So it would be 100 in 1893. And in 1900, Paris was hosting the Universal Exposition, the World's Fair, in other words. So it was decided that a new National Museum of Natural History would have to be built. And they began working on it in 1893 and finished it in 1898. And then they moved Cuvier's Gallery of Comparative Anatomy and the paleontology material. They moved Quartrefages' Gallery of Anthropology. They moved the stuffed animals and bones that were on display from the zoo, the menagerie, which of course, as I said before, is one of the oldest zoos in the world. And that was all brought in and put into this building right down here. And then later they added other buildings. So today we're going into the Comparative Anatomy of Animals and Paleontology Museum. The next building up is the Botanical Museum. The building above that is the Minerals and Geology Museum, and then the main one, which was added in the 1930s, that is known as the Grand Gallery of Evolution, or the Museum of Man. And of course the other buildings off to the side, those are the greenhouses, and you still have the zoo. So that's the whole complex and how it came about. And I would add that not just the collections of Cuvier and Quartrefages collections, but all the people who went traveling in the 1800s and the 1700s all over the world to new places brought back examples and donated them. So these places just fill up with material. When we take the walkthrough of the building, I will show you some of the cabinets, and they are everywhere with specimens on the inside of them. So now we're ready to go into the building. Here we are at the entrance of the Museum of Paleontology and Comparative Anatomy. You would line up, and they would first check your identification to make sure that you had your pass sanitaire, because if you're not vaccinated, you couldn't go into the next section. There you would buy your ticket. It costs 10 euros for the museum per person to go in. Now you notice it is multiple floors. It has a ground floor, it has a first floor, and it has a second floor. And each one of those floors is 27,000 square feet and are 260 feet long, or 80 meters long. And they are literally filled with cabinets on one side, and then you have this huge expanse in the middle where they have all of their displays. So you go in on the first level, you'll have the comparative anatomy of basically modern animals, and then you go up and there's a mezzanine where you can then overlook the whole area and see it from above. Then you go up to the next floor, and that's where the paleontology material is. So you have the dinosaurs and the mammoths, and then you have another mezzanine up above that, which allows you to get the view from one end of it to the other. And many people who have come into this said it was like being in front of the animals marching onto the ark. And that was an intention. The intention to build us was to get this feeling of the movement of time, of the movement of the animals as they go on through. So now let's start looking at the collection. And again, we'll be down on the first floor. This is what you see when you walk through the entrance into the first floor. You see this human in front of this, looks like a stampede of animals. Now, it looks like on the one hand that he could be leading them. It also could look like that they're after him, because actually out in the lobby where you get your tickets, there's a carving, and this marble carving shows these apes strangling a human being over the rocks. So it may have some interesting background to it. But anyway, you see these cases and all of these land animals, and eventually you get way in the back and we'll get to the sea animals. But these are all modern animals that existed in our time. They will have some that are extinct. Now this looks like you can't get into the middle area, but you can. There are certain sections that are roped off so the people just don't wander in and do something they're not supposed to. But there is pretty good access to get around all the different creatures. So you go down the row a little bit and you can see the giraffes in this first picture, and then here we are getting a little closer to some of the other herd animals, and then moving on again we can see a tall giraffe in the background and more herd animals. And then after that second giraffe, then we come into the sea animals. 2/3 of the way down the room we come to the sea creatures. We'll have whales and narwhals and dolphins and all sorts of sea creatures that will be coming towards us. A nice side shot of we got a blue whale in there that's practically the whole length of the building. So you have all of these different species are swimming down the gallery. Here's a little video panorama of the first floor of the museum. Here's a little video of our good friend the blue whale. If the only view you had of the displays was at ground level, it would be overwhelming because the animals are so large in many cases. And you can see the cases around the side too where they have other displays. But that's where the mezzanine level comes in. So here we are up on the mezzanine level looking back at the sea creature section, and you can see the size of the blue whale and some of the other creatures that are along in there. And then when you turn the other direction and you look all the way to the beginning beginning, and you see all of the herd animals and creatures. How stunning it is to see it from this particular vantage point. And we'll go down here in just a second and look at some of the individual examples that you can find. But again, there were actually students that came in that were taking a class, and they were studying the different animals and the different displays, and I believe you can get access to other parts of the museum as well. Sheri and I took hundreds of pictures of these displays because I teach Western Civ and I do a thing on dinosaurs and other stuff, and you never get a chance probably to see this again, so take as many pictures as you can. That's what an electronic camera is for. But here's one of them that I really like, which shows the whales filter for eating the krill and surviving. And then this one happens to be really special. This is a coelacanth. Now, coelacanth was supposed to be extinct 60 million years ago. We have fossils of coelacanths with the dinosaurs. This happens to be a preserved one that was caught off the coast of Madagascar in the 1930s. This was the first time that they had found these in the actual ocean. And since then, they have found schools of them, or areas where you find them. They're usually around South Africa and in the Indian Ocean. But that is one of the original coelacanths, nicely preserved. And then frequently you'll hear about the dodo. Well, here is a dodo skeleton with its mock-up of what it would have looked like if it were still alive. And then, as I mentioned before, they have all of these cases and storage cabinets, and they are everywhere. And some of them you can open, some of them require a key, and so there's all sorts of this material being stored here. You can just spend hours and hours and hours. I would believe that if you saw all of the museums in the complex, it would take you at least a day. I think we were here 2.5 hours, or 3 hours as it was. So let's go up these beautiful iron staircases and get to the next floor, which of course is where all the dinosaurs are located. For the paleontology section, I'm going to go up to the mezzanine first and shoot the dinosaurs from above. Then we'll go down and look at them a little closer. So here we are at the top of the paleontology section. In the front we have our dinosaurs. As we slowly come towards the middle, I guess you could consider the separation between the Pleistocene and the Jurassic period as the Gubbio boundary layer. We then see Pleistocene animals and the mammals. So here's what the paleontology section looks like when you move to the front of the room. Now, you can't really get the full width because I'm as far back as I can get, but there's a Iguanodon that's on the left-hand side that you can't see, and then this Allosaurus, which is right here, and then you look all the way down the distance, and you notice in this case you can really go in between the dinosaurs and the other creatures in this section a little easier, but they're so large that it's really difficult to get good pictures from close up because of their size. Here's the one that you couldn't see very well or at all from the first shot. This is the Iguanodon. And actually, Iguanodon, I believe, is one of the first dinosaurs that Cuvier put together for the collection. And here's an example of the size with how big I am, 6 feet 2, and the Iguanodon on its stand. And then across the way, which we saw in the original picture, is the Allosaurus in its prowling position. As we walk past the Allosaurus and the Iguanodon, you can see coming up the Brontosaurus. It's so huge that, it takes up a vast space. Here's a little closer shot of it. It has the correct head on it. Remember, in American history, when the first one was found, the Othniel Marsh put the wrong head on it. And there was this battle between Nelson Drinker Cope, who said you put the wrong head on it between the two guys. But Othniel Marsh was the most powerful, and it remained that way until the 1970s, when it was found that he indeed had found it before complete and had named it something else. So they then began correcting all the heads that were in American museums at the time. So here is a still from above, so you can see the size of it. Here's a slow video of the Brontosaurus from its head to the tip of its tail. And you can see like a giant crocodile at the end of it by its tail. Here's a couple of shots of the giant crocodile that I was talking about when we were up above with the brontosaurus. And they also have a casting of a raptor in its crouching position, ready to eat you. A wonderful head of a triceratops, which was actually found in the gypsum mine in Paris. And the final thing is, of course, we have to have a pterodactyl. So here's a picture of the pterodactyl from below, down on the floor. And then here's a picture of the pterodactyl from above. And once we reach the pterodactyl area, we can look and see the Pleistocene megafauna staring us in the face. The central shot of the mammal section, period of the Pleistocene and other epochs after the dinosaurs, is pretty astounding from the size. You'll notice the white creature that looks like a sea serpent. Now, that is a Synthicus peruvianus. It's also found in Mississippi. It's originally found in Cynthia, Mississippi. They've also found a version of it in Peru, and we'll get a little closer shot of that later. And of course, you can see the giant sloth next to it. And then in the very back, you see the gigantic woolly mammoth. But they have several mastodons and saber cats and all sorts of creatures from this period which are just gigantic. Now, the Cynthianus, as you see here, is actually part of the whale family, the early whale family. But look at those teeth. Now, the Peruvian version, which is the one that you see here, actually has more molars than the one found in Mississippi. But quite a spectacular way to display it. And then here's a picture of it from above. Here's a video pan of the mastodon area with all the other Pleistocene creatures. And you can see our early whale, and you can see the sloth, and of course the woolly mammoth in the background. Here we are getting up close and personal with a gigantic sloth. The way they have it there with the tree is just stunning. And of course, we have to have a woolly mammoth. So here's a frontal view of the woolly mammoth, and then here's an aerial view of it. You know, the mastodons and the woolly mammoths have this depression in the middle of their foreheads. And in the area of ancient Greece, you will find mastodons and woolly mammoths. And there's some people believe that when you find the skull, that the Greeks made a mistake and believed that that was the single eye, that the idea of the Cyclops came from these skulls. And then once you go by the woolly mammoth, then we see the saber cat, the saber-toothed tiger. And then we finish with the elk. This is the giant elk that would have been found at the same time. And then they have the smaller creatures as well in the museum. And then from the very top, from the mezzanine, this is the view from the opposite end, looking backwards, looking towards the front where the dinosaurs were, moving back this direction where you can see the mammoth and others. So that is the interior of the paleontological and comparative anatomy section of the Museum of Natural History in Paris. Here's our map again of the whole complex of the Jardin des Plantes with its museums. Now originally, Sheri and I were going to go and visit the Paleontology Museum the first day that we were in Paris. And when we went over, it was a little later in the afternoon, and we didn't think we'd be able to get through the museum in its entirety, so we decided to go the next day. When we went back the next day, it was closed. It was Tuesday, their day off. So we were leaving Paris the next day, so we didn't get back to the museum until we had returned later on in October. So after not going to the museum, we then went a walk through the Jardin des Plantes. We had done that before, but I thought I'd show you some things from the whole area. So here we'll be going right down the middle of the Jardin des Plantes, and then we will go over towards the Botanical Gardens and then out this direction till we get to the Rue de Cuvier, and then we'll go back to our hotel. Now here's a picture of the Paleontology Museum from within the garden, and as you can see, all of the growth blocks those buildings. You really don't see them very well. Now, it is fall. We've always gone usually on vacation in May and early June, and sometimes it's not quite as colorful, but there were plenty of plants blooming this time. These beautiful dahlias that were just everywhere. And then when you come to the end, here is the Museum of Man, or the Museum of Evolution. So you turn right. That's where the zoo has always been in on the right-hand side as we've been walking towards the Museum of Man. And then you turn and they have two glass buildings for the botanical gardens. And then after walking through that area, you come down to a common area where they have a variety of statues of various creatures. And that's where they do a lot of their discussions, where they have people giving lectures. And then once you walk by that building, you are there at the Rue de Cuvier. And then we turned around and went back to our hotel Citizen M in Paris. So we hope you enjoyed the trip through the Paleontology Museum. Sheri and I hope you enjoyed the tour. Please come by our YouTube channel at Bob Packett on YouTube. It should be History According to Bob, but it comes up as Bob Packett. That's the easiest way to get to it. And please subscribe and leave some comments. Thank you very much. I've been doing podcasting on history for over 15 years. I've got over 4,000 shows, and I've done CDs, which of course can be sent out as USBs. So if you would really like to get more on history for free, then come by my website, as you see here, historyaccordingtobob.com, and see what's there. So thank you very much again.